did pretty well on its first election. Way back. Way back. Sorry. Let's go back. Here we go. 18. Okay, there are 5 yellow states. The gold color is the Populist Party. So if you look here, this is the one where Grover Cleveland won in the second term. He not only had more electoral votes, he had enough. Benjamin Harrison, who lost his re-election bid in 1892, came in second. What's the good news, bad news about the populist? Look at the map. What's the problem with the populist?
They're only in farmer states.
They're only in farmer states. Plus, the good news for them is you had a pretty good showing. You got 22 electoral votes. The problem is 22 electoral votes doesn't get you anything. Doesn't get you anything. So the reality is, we did say in 93, 94, that in 1893, 94, the country went into a very bad depression. That was like the worst one we ever had. I know you're going to hear that term a lot, oh, this is the worst one ever, but it really was pretty terrible. And again, there's no government safety net. There's no federal welfare. It's not the government's not a major employer. There's no Social Security. There's no Medicare. There's no Medicaid. None of that stuff exists yet. Let's take a look. What are the farmers' options? These Populist Party people. So let's just scroll down. So that was 1892. What if one of these two parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, fused, meaning joined with the Populist Party? What would be the advantage to the populists if the Democrats, for example, which will actually happen, fused with the Populist Party? Look at the votes. 1 million votes for James Weaver, the populist. 5.1 million votes for Benjamin Harrison, the Republican. 5.6 million votes for Grover Cleveland. Populists could make the difference. There's a problem. Why would populists, the party, not really want to join with another party, like the Democrats or Republicans? Why do you think that's the case? What would be the danger to the Populist Party? Which is more important, the Populist Party or the Democratic Party? The Democratic Party. It's the party that's been around since Jackson. The reality is, it's shaping up that the populists know if they run a guy, even with the bad economic times and everyone hates Grover Cleveland, in 1896 is going to be the key year. Because what if I told you the populists could fuse with either the Democrats or Republicans, and that the Democrats wouldn't take everything from the Populist Party? The Populist Party had lots of different things in their platform. I only talked about 3 or 4. Income tax, recollection centers, all that stuff. What if I told you in 1896, just for argument's sake, that the Democratic Party might fuse with the Populist Party to try to pick up their votes? The problem is, the Populist Party is only going to get one shot. It's like bees that sting. Third parties, this guy Richard Hofstadter said, third parties are like bees. Once they sting, they die. So I'm going to pause it now. Go to the bathroom whenever. Okay, we're back. This is a gold bug. I know it sounds crazy, but gold bugs don't want any silver currency at all. They say it's like phony money. They actually did wear this as a pin. A lot of these people are Republicans, and they support this man, William McKinley, who will win the presidency in 1896. He'll win in 1900 and get assassinated in 1901, and Teddy Roosevelt will take over. William McKinley is proud to support the gold standard, meaning no silver, no greenbacks, or anything. I don't want to coin any of that stuff, I just want gold currency. I know we're in a bad depression, but we don't need to basically make the money supply go crazy. What if I told you he's a gold bug? He's proud of the gold standard. He doesn't want, he hated, I'm sure he hated the Silver Purchase Act. He hated the Bland-Allston Act back in the day. He is an Ohio congressman. I'm sorry, he was an Ohio congressman. He's a Republican from the state of Ohio. This man, William Jennings Bryant, there he is. He is a Democrat. He's only been he's really a Democrat. However, he's going to allow one element of the Populist Party. So they're going to fuse the Populist Party and the Democratic Party in 1896. He is really a Democrat, but he's going to lend himself to support, his name's William James Bryant, he's going to basically support only one thing, the free coinage of silver. So he's certainly not a gold bug. He wants to see inflation to help the farmers. In fact, he gave a hell of a speech in 1896 for the campaign. Now, this is mocking him, that's him. He was only 36 years old. He's a devout Christian, believes pretty much every word in the Bible is literally true. And he said to Democrats, because McKinley already announced, I'm going to be the nominee, and I'm a gold bug, I will never support anything but the gold standard, I don't want to see anything but gold. I don't want to see silver, that would be crazy inflation, that would stink. He gave a speech, William James Bryant, in 1896, called the Cross of Gold speech. Now, you have to understand, you know anything about Jesus' crucifixion? How did Jesus die?
He was crucified.
Yeah, and they put a crown of thorns to mock him as the king of the Jews around his head. It just caused him to believe it was extremely painful, I'm sure. Of course, having the nail marks in his hands and his feet and stuff must have been excruciating. But he said, I'm a Democrat, but I will take the one element from the Populist Party, only one, the free and unlimited coinage of silver. He said, let them not press down this crown. They acted this out, there's no megaphones or anything, there's no PA systems. Let them not press down this crown of thorns on the brow, it's the brow of labor. Let them not crucify mankind on this cross of gold. The populists, 99% of them, the Democrats went crazy, this is brilliant. We'll basically solve the problem of the country by having an unlimited coinage of silver at 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. That will cause more money, farmers will get more money, be able to charge more for their crops, and that would basically solve their problem. Who doesn't want to see farm prices go up? You and me. I'm not a farmer. I like to basically spend $100 on my groceries, not $200. So realistically, this was the best chance they had. By the way, what was the danger to the Populist Party of fusing with the Democrats? What's the danger? The Populist Party, the Democratic Party, which is the main party, only took one element of the whole Populist Party platform. Only one. They didn't take anything else. And what ends up happening is that McKinley ran a campaign from the front porch of his house in Canton, Ohio, where the Football Hall of Fame is. McKinley pretty much badly beat William James Bryant. If you notice, it's hard to see here, Republican is McKinley, Bryant is a Democrat and a populist. What do you think would happen to the Populist Party after this election, if you had to say? What do you think would happen to the Populist Party after 1896? It dies, just like those bees. They sting and they die. The Democrats were not going to take income tax or graduated any regulation or anything like that, or an 8-hour day. The Democrats weren't going to take direct election of senators. They were only going to take just the silver at 16 to 1, which is one of the things the populists wanted. There's not all bad news. In the Yukon and in the Klondike, up in Alaska and Canada, and also in South Africa, they're finding large quantities. We went on the gold standard. We did not coin silver. What ended up happening is, it was almost like divine providence, but they started to find a lot more gold. And when they found more gold, the fact is that added to the world gold supply. And some of that gold supply ended up in America. So The fact is, up in the Yukon, on the Klondike, up in Canada and Alaska, they found gold. We own Alaska. And then they found gold in South Africa, more gold in South Africa. So the overall gold supply increased. What did that mean? What does that mean for the money supply?
Inflation.
Yeah. There's going to be more gold in the bucket. And again, we only printed dollars if we had gold. So he'll run again, the same two guys, in 1900, William James Bryant, again the Democrat populist, but he's really a Democrat. And in 1900, the same thing happened. William James Bryant actually ran for president in LA 3 times. He lost all 3 times. People don't care about the silver thing anymore because we don't back our money with gold or silver. How do we rate our money in the United States today? By the way, if you want to be a really rich guy, be a currency trader. I'll give you a hint. The euro or the shekel. How do we rate our currency? The euro is the currency of most European countries, right?
What do you mean, how do we do that against other countries?
People who are basically buy American dollars, buy euros, if it's right, or buy shekels or whatever the currency is in other countries like yen in Japan. And the bottom line is basically they trade, they're currency traders. They say, oh, the Chinese yuan, I think it's called, their currency is very weak, so I'm going to buy more dollars. And that will actually change the economy somehow. But currency traders generally make a lot of money, but you cannot go to a bank today and say, here's $100, I want a gold coin. They will say, get out, because we don't back our currency. And again, I said yesterday, I don't have to look at it because I know it off the top of my head. You do too. This note is legal tender for all debts public and private. The government says it's money, so we believe it. You can't redeem this from gold and silver anymore. You can't. So the gold bugs won. But it wasn't too bad because the farmers ended up getting, because of the overall increase in gold supply, a lot more gold in the world economy, including the American economy. And they had about 20 years of good inflation, and people sort of forgot about the Populist Party, and the party died. They were like that bee that died. So let me pause this now, and I'm going to basically stop. This is the end of chapter 23. Okay, we're back. Chapter 26. It's not that long a chapter, and some of the stuff we already covered in chapter 23 that dealt with populists and the rest of that stuff. We've had basically 3 policies in the 1800s of dealing with Native Americans, right? We did, I don't know if you know that, but we did. What do you think some of the policies was? Oh wait, they're not citizens. They're not only in the 20th century did they become citizens. Even the 14th Amendment did not make Indians citizens. But a lot of the Indians lived in this area, Great Plains. So what? Well, we had 3 policies. One's not very humane. What's the inhumane policy that the white federal government had with Native Americans? Well, Ellie, you could kill them. You could exterminate them. What's the other possibility? You could kick them out. Jackson did that with the Trail of Tears, right? And his successor was Martin Van Buren. He kicked the Indians out, and they put them on, what did the Indians end up on a what?
Trail of Tears.
Yeah, where they end up is actually an Indian reservation. The other hope you have is maybe we could assimilate them. Make them like us. The reality, though, the government and most Americans view them as savages. They're not really human. They're lower than black people because black people became citizens with the 14th Amendment. And all those bad things happened. We could assimilate the Indians and make them like us, so maybe someday, 100, 200 years from now, they'd be sort of like us. We have a lot of assimilation. I mean, let's face it, I have a lot of friends of mine, Jen and Lisa, like basically babka. Neither one of them is Jewish, neither one of them is, and he has no anything about that, but some Jewish stuff has made its way into, the American world. Babka, bagels, what's that? Chicken soup, matzo ball soup, exactly. And in fact, we became sort of, in a way, more Jewish. That's what America's about. Remember, we're the melting pot. The thing is, what about the Indians? Come on, David, you're off target. The Indians, let's try this over here. It's off.
Disoriented.
Is that?
Disoriented.
It is disorienting. So the Indians who live in the Great Plains. Well, I'll tell you, here's the Great Plains. Here's up, it goes through Canada, goes down to Texas. Lots of different Indians live here, Native Americans. But I use the term Indians for simplicity. There's a problem. The Native Americans, because of the introduction of the horse, gave up farming in the Great Plains. Well, how do they live? How do Indians in the Great Plains live? Well, sorry. I had that a second ago. They live on the buffalo. The Indians who lived in the Great Plains generally were mobile warriors. They followed the buffalo, and they used the buffalo very efficiently. They made tools out of the bones, they ate the meat, they salted the meat and smoked it. They basically could use the fur for stuff. The reality is they even used the bladder of the buffalo, because it's watertight, to basically hold liquids. I would not want to drink out of a former bison's bladder, but the Native Americans generally were mobile, and they traveled after the bison and lived off them. What makes good? What's the problem with that? There were like tens of millions of bison. Estimates are from like 16 million to 30 million bison. It was buffalo, we're going to call them buffalo. They lived in this area. They were here before white people were here. What's the problem with the Native Americans being dependent on a mobile food source? Bison travel.
Yeah.
So what? What's the one thing that white people don't want to see? Indians trespassing on their land with chasing after these bison. The bison destroy all the crops and stuff. The government decided, we're going to put these Indians on reservations. Land will be reserved for them. It's a problem. What if the bison don't come towards the reservation? Then the Indians starve. These Indians don't have a friend in Congress. There's not a lot of people sympathetic to the Indians. And the bottom line, basically, one of the guys who's absolutely not sympathetic to Indians is this guy, who you've certainly heard of, George Armstrong Custer. The government's policy was, we're going to try to kill off the Indian culture. It's savage, they kill whites, they trespass, they blow, we can't build the railroads we want because the railroads are there. Now this is, remember this, take a look at this. It's not the other bones, it's just the bison skulls. Explain, what do you think of it? These guys Indians?
No.
What are they?
Whites, they killed the buffaloes, the Indians when we fought.
They said if you kill the bison, you'll kill the Indians, and the Indians will have to assimilate, or we'll keep the Indians on reservations. Now, something you may not know about Native Americans is that, by the way, we were completely, as white people, indiscriminate killing bison. The Indians only took as much bison as they needed. They left millions of them alive. White people decided, and the government and the army, to basically crack down on the Native Americans because we don't want these Indians traveling from here to there. We want to keep them on a reservation. The problem is the bison don't go to the reservation and they starve to death. So he was one of the army officers who was put in charge of cracking down on the Indians. Unfortunately for him, in late June of 1876, literally about a week before the country's centennial, it is 1876. Next week would be the 4th of July, and the country's going to celebrate 100 years since the Declaration of Independence was made back in 1796. This is now 1896. He decided that basically we really need that Indian land. But like, didn't the government give Indians land? Yes. It was really their land to begin with. Let's face it, they were here first. Problem is, the government broke every promise it made to Native Americans. They decided to put them on reservations, and if the reservations basically didn't have enough food, they would sort of be like welfare recipients living off the federal government. Because the Native Americans don't have any friends in Congress, and there are no Native Americans who are in Congress because they're not citizens, they're not covered by the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment or anything like that. I will tell you that Native Americans only became citizens in 1924. 1924. The reality is, guys like Custer, who did not do too well at the Battle of Little Bighorn, see, he was a thief to them. Because the Indians were given, particularly the Sioux Indians who live here, the Sioux Indians were confined to a reservation. It was a really big reservation. It was a problem. Custer had led, with White Death, had led lots of other white miners into Indian land. And this is illegal. And the Indians were very upset, and the government basically found out something very interesting for the government. What do you think was on that Indian land? That's the most important resource we were just talking about, gold. The government found gold on Indian land. Really, it was white miner guys found it. What does that mean? Well, they're going to start trespassing into Indian land to go get the gold. And if they kill 100 or 200 Indians, then so be it. The reality is, he met a very unfortunate end. And for over 100 years after his death, people were like, what a heroic man, Custer's last stand. And again, he is killed at the Battle of the Bighorn in June 25th. He was basically a colossal egomaniac. He had been sent out to go kill or capture the Indians and bring them back to reservations. Reservations that didn't have any gold. This doesn't have a happy ending. What is significant is her. Her name is Helen Hunt Jackson. She is an American writer. As you can see, she's a white woman. She wrote a book. It's called A Century of Dishonor. First of all, what's unique about her? She's a woman who writes books. There aren't that many of those, particularly. She wrote this book, Helen Hunt Jackson did, and what do you think, looking at the title, we're going to actually judge a book by its cover in this case, what do you think A Century of Dishonor means?
100 years of not being true to the Native Americans.
Every promise the government and white people had made to Indians, they've broken. Custer had broken many promises to Indians. They never hunt them down, exterminate them. It was Army policy to kill bison. So you kill the bison, indirectly you kill the Indians. She thought, this is terrible. The Indians, I will tell you today, even Native Americans today, are the poorest population in America, poorer than anyone else, blacks, Latinos, Mexicans, anything like that. Puerto Ricans, they're poorer than them. They had the shortest life expectancy on average, Native Americans do, even in modern times. The Indians who live in the Great Plains don't live to like 75 like Grandpa does. They live to their 50s, and then they die. They're also basically, unfortunately, many of them are addicted to alcohol and now in modern times drugs. What's significant is Native Americans, people were very upset when they read this book. Now, even though the Indians weren't citizens, people said, you know, she's right. She's an American writer. She writes about the abomination of the fact that Indian policy had been terrible for 100 years. In fact, there is going to be an alternative. Something will come out of this. The government decided, let's see about this. The government decided we're going to try to Americanize the Indians. And I want to show you the guy who tried to do it. He's a senator from, if I remember correctly, Michigan. said, why don't we make the Indians citizens, like citizens way down the road? He said, let's try to force the Indians to assimilate, to be just like us white guys. Why would we do that? So that someday, way in the future, 25, 30, maybe 50 years later, we'll make them citizens after we assimilate them enough. The Dawes Act was the idea that the government said, we're going to take these Indians. Now, you remember the Homestead Act we talked about, 160-acre plots? You learned about that in the Civil War. Why don't we basically try to make the Indians farmers in the Great Plains? We'll try to assimilate them and make them like us. I want to show you a picture. It's an interesting picture. My students like when I show them the picture. Let's take a look. There's my picture. Let me turn the light on so this is more visible. This is what the Dawes Act tried to do. Why am I showing you this picture of these two guys? It's the same guy, you're right. Notice his skin was a lot darker when he lived as a Native American. He's out in the sun all day. Although Native Americans, apart from the fact that they have a high likelihood of becoming alcoholics because of the way their bodies are put together. Same guy. This is what the Dawes Act promised to do. Make them family farmers and make them live out and like white people, and someday down the road, this is what the Dawes Act did, we'll make them citizens. That guy is that guy a couple of years ago. Well, if I told you, as I did, that Native Americans don't live very long, and I did tell you that Native Americans in modern times are the poorest population, least likely to go to college, greatest level of poverty of any population, lower than anybody else you could think of, life expectancy, bad, college graduation rate, high school diplomas, in modern times, it's a disgrace. And she thought, back in the day, that we should do something about it. The idea that we're going to forcefully assimilate these Indians to make them like white people, make them live on the land, well, we'll have to live on farms with that each Indian family, because like there is something unique to a shul and Native Americans, the way they used to live, in that they communally made decisions, right? They sort of like the tribe had lots of different chiefs, and the chiefs basically made essentially decisions as a group, just like a shul will. There's not one guy who runs the shul, right? It's like a group of guys, right? Usually. The government decided to take away tribal authority and make these Indians into like little 160-acre plot white guys that someday they'll become citizens and be just like us. If you had to guess, what do you think happened?
Didn't work.
The same era that white people were failing in farming left and right. It's the same era that the government is trying to force these Indians to become farmers. What they want is what they can't have. What they want is the bison back. Let's put it this way, and my numbers are not wrong on this one, this is crazy. There were somewhere between, in about a 25-year time span, there were between like 13 and 30 million bison just roaming around the Great Plains. Then the army and white people decided to exterminate the Indians, the bison, to go destroy the Indian culture. So what? Well, at the end of the day, the bison were almost extinct. They went from 13 to 30 million bison to about 900 bison left. When you see bison today, they're mostly in a cage, and most of them live in Canada because the Americans killed them off as a way to get to the Indians. The reality is, the American policy towards Native Americans has been pretty terrible. So, the government tried to assimilate them. They looked at, even Helen Hunt Jackson thought that Native Americans should essentially assimilate. That guy is that guy. The reality is, we were in no rush to make them citizens. In fact, the last example of Indian violence is the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Indians here in the Dakotas, the Indians on their own, despite the Dawes Act, despite the forced assimilation, the Indians started to practice something called the ghost dance. This is about 20-some years after Custer died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. That was the peak of Indian power, or really not the peak, but it's the last success the Indians ever had. This is not an Indian success. This is a massacre at Wounded Knee, which is on a large Indian reservation. The Indians thought, Native Americans, that if they could dance, this particular dance, sort of like the hora, or a kumsitz, but this one is a spiritual Indian dance called a ghost dance, that the whites would be destroyed, the bison will come back, and the Indians will thrive once again. The government viewed this, the army really, as a threat to order and considered this an outrageous thing, and the government decided to break up the ghost dance. The response in 1890 was this massacre of a couple of hundred of these Native Americans. Massacres of Indians was common by the government. That's why Little Bighorn was unusual. This is an army. Custer was a Civil War general. It's an army of repeating rifles and cannons and artillery and Gatling guns. How could Indians possibly beat the army? Well, Custer didn't do that well, so Custer got killed. But really, the reality is the government's plan is that the Indians have to be like us. Someday we'll make them citizens. Someday the Indians will be able to do what they want with their land, but we got to end the tribal stuff. It hasn't really worked very well. Many Native Americans, basically, they are citizens. They've been citizens for almost 100 years now. The reality is they are still poor. There's not a lot of Native American congressmen. There's not a lot of Native American companies or businesses you've ever heard of. There's no Native American companies I know of that actually make computers or cars or anything else you could think of. They are a poor population. And they're also one other thing. There's not a lot of them left. Because of exposure to white bad things like alcohol and of course the army back then in the 1800s, that did not work out so well. So what's significant for us is that Native Americans didn't really have a shot. There's another thing too I should tell you. One of the big industries out there, as I pull a picture, one of the big industries out there was mining. Now we know a lot of the land where the Indians live is where this happens to be, there's gold there. This is gold and silver strikes, mineral wealth. Gold, silver, copper. Copper is a semi-precious metal. So from this perspective, mining became a really big thing because the government backed its currency with either gold or silver, or just maybe gold alone. And the bottom line is the government needed that gold. By the way, in the case of what led to Custer's last stand in '76, the government, even though they made a policy to basically that a certain amount of land in 1868, it's called the Fort Laramie Treaty, that the land will belong to the Indians forever. Illegal white miners, including Custer, found gold there. So the government said, I know we just made this treaty a couple of years ago, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, you guys got to go, because we need that gold for the economy. And the Indians considered it a gigantic slap in the face, a gigantic screw you to Native Americans. The government had broken the promises. Mining is really important because we do believe that precious metals and other things are really valuable, particularly because the country is so dependent on the gold standard. We're almost done. What's also significant is that people out west view land as basically being almost everlasting. So if you looked at let's take a look. The cattle trails. Hopefully I get as big a picture as I can. There we go, it's pretty good. The same places that Indians live, cattlemen. These are not farmers. These are guys that own ranches. And what they actually have is the Texas Longhorn, which is meaty and delicious. You can make burgers out of it, steaks and everything else. What's significant is the land that the Indians lived on that used to have the bison. We're going to kill the bison and we're going to start moving these cattle, longhorns. By the way, back in the day, when I was a kid, a lot of guys, Texas, rich guys, used to have the longhorns on the front of their Cadillac, on the grill. And they had like obnoxious horns that made a weird sound. So imagine if you could, this on the front of the Cadillac. You want to see it? So, cattlemen back in the 70s, a lot of this is the, I remember this car vividly. This was the Eldorado. See the horns? There was a time when people realized, Ellie, if we could, I know that's the same land Indians lived on, but they're going to get the Indians off the land and put them on reservations away from people. There was a time when really nobody owned this land. Now, that's not really true. This area is where the Trail of Tears ended. It was, in policy, it's now the state of Oklahoma. But there was a time, it was called Indian Territory. It was unorganized. And the government basically took like 30 Native American tribes back in before 1850 and put them in Oklahoma, including the Cherokee and other tribes like the Creeks, and the rest of these Indians ended up there, and they're just a mixed bag. What's significant, there was a time when these cattle really thrived in the southern Great Plains. The problem is, they knew I could buy a Texas Longhorn for about $5. That same Longhorn is worth $50 in Chicago. Now, how did I get it from there to Chicago, which is over here? Well, sorry, I'm gonna sneeze. You gotta get the cowboys to bring them to the nearest railroad link, which is in Kansas. The problem is they would trespass over all this land, including Indian land. But the fact is, this is not a road. These are cattle trails. They have funny names like Goodnight Loving's Trail, and the Shawnee Trail, and the Chisholm Trail. And the idea was, if we can get these cattle from southern Texas up to Kansas, we'll put them on a rail car, send them to Chicago, and have them at a slaughterhouse, and eventually people on the East Coast will eat a week later or 2 weeks later. Even better, when they have refrigerated rail cars, it would be even better if they basically were able to make those steaks, get those steaks in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, that kind of thing, Washington D.C., and here in New Jersey. They realized that these cattle trails, and this is the same area, the general sentiment of the government and American people at the time in the late 1870s and the 80s was, why don't we just take the land from the Indians? We'll basically have cowboys that will actually thrive in this area. And the problem is, eventually, farmers and cattlemen are the guys who own these. These guys, what really destroyed the old cowboy era was barbed wire and farming. Because barbed wire was invented by an American named Joseph Glidden, and he decided that we're going to have super cheap, it is longhorn resistant. Because it's barbed wire, it's going to be used in wartime too, but because it's barbed wire, we're going to basically try to keep these places, these creatures penned. So what's significant is the cattle, for about 20 years, went from southern Texas to central Texas to Kansas. That was the nearest railroad link. But after the 1880s, a combination of bad weather and bad weather, super terrible winters, terrible summers, the cattle actually ate on their way. And they traveled about 700 miles from central and southern Texas to Kansas, where they're alive, get them to Chicago, make them into steaks. Kansas City's known for its steaks too. But this is something, this era of the cowboy was a very short era. Now there still are cowboys technically today, but they're not, I can assure you, Ellie, traveling 700 miles, going basically from southern Texas all the way to Kansas. First of all, because of the bad weather and the longhorn being exposed to these terrible elements, what ended up happening is that the longhorn tended to die in gigantic numbers because they had terrible winters, terrible droughts. There's not a lot of water in this area. What's significant is the cattle area didn't last very long. But when it did die out, what's significant is basically it still left a legacy that people like, the idea of the cowboy image. It's the ultimate example of an American. When I was a kid, the big actor that everybody remembered was John Wayne. That was not his real name, by the way. So these cattle trails were really significant. But the thing that cattlemen hate is barbed wire. And there was a song in the cattlemen's era. It's called "Don't Fence Me In." Don't fence me in with barbed wire. I want to show you one last thing. I can't go on much longer. Sod busters. I will show you a lot of the people who became farmers out there. It's going to sound odd. Ellie, it's a house made of grass. The farmers, the miners, the cattlemen, and the Indians all live on the same land. Explain. I will tell you, just as a hint, there's no trees in most of the Great Plains. So what? This is called a sod house. Sod like grass. It's a house made up of grass, bricks, and mud. And eventually, these were the first farmers in the Great Plains. They were known as sod busters. They busted up the sod with a really big, strong plow, a steel plow from John Deere generally. And they made these houses, because there's only like no wood out there to build a house, they made these houses out of grass. This is the same area that the Indians live in. It's the same area that the cattle are going to be, traveling long distances. These guys eventually get barbed wire and put barbed wire enclosures around their land. And the bottom line is, there was a view to many Americans at the time that the land out west would last forever. And in fact, there was a guy, an American historian, named Frederick Jackson Turner, who made something called the Turner Thesis. There he is. I also want to say one other thing. 1890 census. The census, they count everybody every 10 years. They'll start counting next year, 2020, right? He said, he's a white guy, he's a white historian, and he developed something called the Frontier Thesis. And people realized the era of the cowboys, the era of the Indians, the era of sod busters isn't going to last forever. In fact, he said the thing that really defined America ended in 1890. Let me explain. In 1890, the Census Bureau, which I guess is under the Department of Commerce, realized something very sort of sad. They said, the frontier is gone. There's no more frontier. Pretty much anywhere in the continental United States, we're not thinking Alaska, but anywhere in the continental United States, white people are living there. Frederick Jackson Turner and his Frontier Thesis said that the frontier thing was unique to America. People in like European countries like to watch American Westerns because America had a great West to be conquered, right? People generally thought that the land out west, the mineral resources with the miners, the cows, the gold resources, the cattle land, the farms, that land should be exploited and used up and basically to make American lives better. Some people feel that way. That's not a really environmentally conscious way, but people didn't think that way. He had a Turner Thesis, which basically said, and he wrote this around 1890, he said the frontier is now gone. And with the death of the frontier, there was always a possibility that you could always say, the hell with it, I'm gonna go out and become a farmer out west somewhere. If you were living in Lowell, Massachusetts at the textile mills, if you were living in New York City, you're living in parts of Brooklyn, you're a Jewish immigrant, there was always a possibility of, I'm gonna go discover myself out west. Teddy Roosevelt did this. And the reality is, the Frontier Thesis basically said, in his view, that white people had conquered all this amazing stuff and that the West was built on democracy and choice and individualism and American freedom. And when the Census Bureau said in 1890 that the frontier is dead, you can still go out to Nevada, but thousands of people have been there. The reality is, the average American viewed the West as something to be exploited, something to be taken advantage of. Forests to be chopped down to make, houses. Gold and silver to be dug up to end up in our currency. Cattle are going to travel over the land and basically live off the land until we get them to the cattle. The railroad stopped, and we'll get them to Chicago, and we'll slaughter them, and we'll eat them. Generally, the view was we're going to consume all this stuff out west. So this essentially is the last place I'll end with the Turner Thesis, which essentially is that the land isn't going to last forever. And he basically said, the sad thing is, white people brought civilization to the West. And it's really tragic. Part of the problem with the Turner Thesis, in modern times, historians said, in modern times, since him, well, didn't like Indians live out there? And weren't there a lot of women out there in the West? What about the Mexicans? They've been living there before the white Americans were. The Turner Thesis is really focused on white guys. But what about women? The first states to give women the right to vote are Western states. It's true. They're like 50 years ahead of New Jersey. When women did get the right to vote in 1920, with the 19th Amendment, they were already voting in Wyoming and Utah and Montana. The idea of the Turner Thesis is really like for white guys only. And was it really all about democracy and freedom and individualism? Well, it wasn't when they exterminated the Indians who lived there, and the bison, and the Indians, and the Mexicans, and Chinese laborers who worked in the mines in California and built the Western railroads. They are also part of the American experiment. But the problem with the Turner Thesis is it's like for whites only. So I'll stop now. You have any questions before I let you go? Okay.